call to order the regular planning. Oh, no, no. Well, we also have Kevin, who is a big IT guy. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Can you hear it?
Yeah, that works.
Oh, it's okay. Testing, testing. Okay, we'll officially call to order the regular Planning Commission meeting for November. And can we have a roll call, please?
Yes, good evening. Commissioner Lasky,
Here.
Commissioner Slaymaker,
Here.
Commissioner Burke,
Here.
Chair Carapiet,
Here.
Vice Chair Johnson,
Here.
Commissioner Seidel,
Here.
Commissioner Hart.
Yes, here.
Thank you.
Okay, move on to agenda item B, the open forum. This is an opportunity for any citizen to briefly address the Planning Commission on any matter that does not appear on this agenda. Upon being recognized by the chair, please state your name and limit your oral statement to no more than 3 minutes. Matters that appear to warrant a more lengthy presentation or commission consideration will be agendized for further discussion at a later meeting. Is there anyone in chambers who wishes to address? Anyone on Zoom?
I see no one on Zoom.
Okay. Moving on to reports. The report agenda items consist of any oral reports from standing planning commission committees, an individual member of the planning commission, and staff. Are there any reports? Seeing none, we move on to the consent calendar. The consent calendar consists of items that the Planning Commission considers to be non-controversial unless any item is specifically removed by any member of the Planning Commission, staff, or audience. The consent calendar will be adopted by one motion. Items removed will be considered in the sequence as they appear below. If any member of the audience wishes to have an item removed, please raise your hand. If you're on Zoom, please raise your hand in the bottom of the screen. The draft, okay. The consent calendar consists of the draft meetings of October 17th, 2023, a regular planning meeting, and Planning Commission consideration for application for design review, exception to total floor area and variance for an addition remodel at the existing residence located at 107 Acacia Avenue. Does anyone on the commission wish to remove or have any questions on any of the items on the consent calendar? Anyone in the audience that would wish us to? I show here it was October 17th. I don't know, the thing says September 19th. The agenda says September 19th, but really we're approving the October 17th meetings.
That is correct. That is an error on the agenda.
So does that mean we can't approve it?
I think because they're in draft form, you can still make a motion. And if we need to, we can bring them back next month
Okay,
if it's an error.
okay, great. Okay, thanks. Anyone in the audience wishing to remove anything from the consent calendar? Seeing none. Anyone on Zoom?
I see no one on Zoom.
May I have a motion, please?
I move to accept. Oh, thank you. I move to accept the consent calendar.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, moving on to public hearings. Item number 3, may we please have a staff report?
Thank you, Chair Carapiet, and good evening, Commissioners. My name is Tony Boyd. I'm Public Works Director, and I'm here to walk you through a proposed addition and improvement to Park Lane steps. As you may know, Park Lane is one of the city's 22 named lanes, and it lies between Golden Gate Avenue above and Belvedere Avenue below. It's at the end of Golden Gate Avenue and next to 450 Belvedere Avenue. This lane is mostly concrete steps. Starting at the top, it's almost 90% of the way down is concrete, and the lowest portion of the steps is a small set of wooden stairs. These stairs have had repairs made over the years, but they are not in the best condition. They have deteriorated, and one of the things we're seeking to do is replace these with concrete steps. In 2019, a small triangle of land was deeded to the city next to the steps, with the stated intention at the time from staff and Parks Open Space and Lanes Committee, who worked on this arrangement, to provide a landing and a bench for people to be able to sit next to Park Lane steps. Since that time, staff and the Parks and Open Space Lane Committee has worked with a landscape architect and been through some design decisions and arrived at what you have now in front of you, which is a new set of concrete steps and a landing with a bench at Park Lane steps. So this first image that we have over here is the existing layout, and you can see that the steps are a straight orientation from the street. They kind of go up at an angle, and that would be replaced with a curved staircase, which I'll move to next, and that's what we have here. So the bottom 4 or 5 steps maintain the alignment of the existing steps at Belvedere Avenue, but they curve with one small landing, and then they get up to the main landing, which is where the new bench would be, and then they're connected to the remaining concrete steps. The stairs would be mostly on grade. There would be micropiles to support them. And some of the other issues facing the project, well, one of the main issues is that there's a PG&E trench that runs alongside the steps. And so the structural work would have to work around that. The plan is for the bench to run from the side of the existing concrete steps across the landing. And it would also act as a small retaining wall. There is, I'll just flick back to the previous slide so we can see the different shaded areas. Those represent landscaping plantings. The darker area at the upper section will be for screening plants, and at this point, the landscape architect recommends just one screening plant. It would be a plant such as privet, Pacific wax myrtle, Leptospermum levigatum, or something like coyote bush. ironically enough, of course, in Belvedere. We could just have it all around. We've got plenty of it. Ground cover would be something like Correa, Mullenbergia, dubia, Ceslaria. So those are bunch grasses. Loropetalum chinensis in the green form, Octostaphylos, emerald carpet, Octostaphylos Pacific mist, Octostaphylos bakeri, Louise Edmonds. So those are all ground cover species of manzanita. And then Baccharis pilularis, pigeon point, which is also a coyote bush, but it's in a low-growing form. So those are the options. The challenges with the landscaping are that there is no irrigation available that we're aware of. Certainly not a dedicated irrigation meter. It's a steep slope, it's shaded, and it's quite a small area as it is. And so, well, the other main challenge actually is maintenance. We in Public Works are very aware that capacity is very important, and we have a number of landscapes that we currently maintain and really are only able to do the minimum with. And so any landscape that we install here, we would hate to see 6 months down the line being in terrible condition because we're unable to keep it in good shape. So the idea is to have really as minimum landscaping as possible, but maintaining the appearance of the surrounding area, tying it in with the trees that are around it, and using bark mulch and some plants to prevent erosion and to keep it in a low maintenance condition. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions.
Anyone have any questions? Claire?
So as far as the planting is concerned, are we pretty deer proof with what's going in?
Yes, I believe so. I think that was definitely one of the challenges and that the landscape architect is aware of. And I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know that a lot of these do grow around Belvedere. They're quite commonly seen. Deer proof, I guess, is a relative term. They'll usually try anything twice, as far as I've seen. But that is definitely one of the concerns. Yeah.
Kevin?
Did we received one comment or one letter from one resident? Did we receive anything else?
Not that I'm aware of, and I can check with.
No, we have not.
And specifically, no adjoining neighbors have issued any concerns or shared any concerns?
Not that I'm aware of. I through sort of third hand, I had heard that one neighbor was had a concern that some of this construction may be on their property. But I've spoken to the surveyor and also would assure them and anybody else that before we do any construction, we would be absolutely certain of property lines.
Thank you.
I contacted the neighbor to the south of this lane, and she seemed nearly unaware that what was happening. So I was a little surprised that nobody had reached out to get input from her.
And south of the lane being 450 Belvedere Avenue. Okay. Yep. Yeah, that I have not spoken to them. No.
Anyone else? Ashley?
Do the lane signs fall under your purview as well, or is that a separate?
Lane signs fall under the purview of Roger Felton, who's a distinguished member of the Belvedere community. He paints them and provides them to us to install. So we install them, but he does the work.
Okay, thank you.
I have an off the subject question. So if Roger does all the lane drawings or paintings. At 270 Beach, it's a very modern sign. He did not do that sign.
Correct. I
Okay.
believe that's a very brand new sign that's
Yeah.
just gone in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
um,
metal.
Right.
or
Yep. And
Brass or whatever.
yeah, no, he didn't do that one. And that must have been, I know it's been in the works for a while, but was part of the construction project at the property next to the lane. Some work on the lane also happened.
Okay. And then the other question I have is, ties into a little bit of the comments we did receive. You're doing a landing there with a bench, which invites people to sit and rest. And it also encourages people to have a little picnic there or bring some snacks or have a bottle water that they drank out of. And then there's no trash recycle bin anywhere within reason. So if we do something like this, it seems like we are inviting an increase in trash. Are there plans to put a trash bin around there that people could drop their?
There are no plans right now. It's something that has been discussed. And I think we would probably want to wait and see. There are, issues with cans. Servicing is important, and being able to access a can. Sometimes, counterintuitively, when you have a can, you actually are almost, you actually almost create trash because it's a place to bring trash. So whereas people might naturally take their plastic bottle with them, they end up leaving it behind, and they might not, they might throw it to the can and it doesn't make it in there. So there's definitely issues that we find with trash cans that we would look at it seriously. And if there was a trash issue there, then and a trash can, that would probably become the alternative that we would go for. Yeah.
So can you explain to me the purpose of the lanes? Am I understanding the lanes were created way back when, primarily for residents to go up the hill or down the hill, primarily from the ferry service? And this seems to be a bit changing the use of the lanes to rather than just emergency use and pleasure use, exercise use to expanding the use that it was intended for.
Well, some other lanes do have benches as well. So it wouldn't be the first time that a bench is added to a lane. Pagoda Lane, actually, just above the yacht club, has a bench, for example, with a view sort of over the yacht club. The capacity of the lanes of this lane would stay the same. There would be no additional parking, so there's no expectation of any additional use because of a bench being added. If one thing that you might notice about this lane going up and down it is that there are no brakes right now, no landings even. So it's actually and it's quite steep. So it's quite a climb. So a bench isn't. I don't think it would be an unwelcome addition. And I don't think it would change the fact that it's still the lanes are mainly used by people exercising around the island right now. They're a shortcut if people want to get from one place to another. And then, of course, the main reason that we do want to maintain them and keep them robust is because they're evacuation routes. And this wouldn't change the fact that it's an evacuation route. It would it would add to the other uses, really.
Okay, thank
Good.
you. Anyone else? Marcia?
I actually go use that lane several times a month, and it'd be nice to have a place to sit. And I'm usually, and I know someone else also walks to the end of Golden Gate and uses that bench, and there's no trash receptacle. And I think in several years, I've seen one person walking there who is not from Belvedere.
Hmm.
So I don't see that as attracting anyone coming either. And it doesn't seem to, there's never any trash there. So I don't think that's so much of a problem.
Go ahead. Claire.
I also have a bench right above my house. And it's really wonderful to see the neighbors walking around and taking advantage of the bench. So I have, good positive thoughts on that.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. I open up the public hearing. Anyone wish to speak? Mr. Kemitzer?
Press the button. Okay, all right. Yeah, I want to speak in support of this project. When I was head of Parks and Open Space, this project came before us, 2019, 2020. In my mind, it's been going on for a long time, and I'd like to see it finished. I think the staff has done a great job in preparing their report, and I would ask that you approve this lane. Interestingly enough, I actually was out there yesterday, and Linda Applewhite happened to be coming down, which is a neighbor, and she was all in favor of this lane. And in fact, if you look at the staff report on page 2, it talks about that it was for the public benefit and to allow the seating area or pause point for the public in a location that affords views of Golden Gate. And I looked at that and I thought it was so nice to see the city and the neighbors working together for the benefit of all of us in the community. And it really is, I think, a great design. As Tony mentioned, the stairs down at the bottom that are wood really need to be replaced. So, that's part of the cost of the project. I also would hope, Belvedere Community Foundation has been absolutely fantastic in helping us in funding projects such as Golden Gate Lane. They really stepped up to the plate. They stepped up to it in the playground. And I look back at what their mission is, which is to help sustain Belvedere's natural beauty and quality of life by encouraging and funding projects that enhance our community and cultivate generosity. And this is exactly what I think that this project would do. I want to mention some of the stuff that Linda and I chatted about yesterday. And one was just to make sure that the project is right online with the design. And Linda talked about it. The fences are a little out of whack right now, but I'm sure the city and the project will work on that. The other thing that they have planted, actually, bay laurel right behind their fence, which is a barrier. They planted it all along Park Lane, so they've actually done some of the landscaping for us. So basically, in conclusion, I request that you adopt the resolution and approve what the city staff has recommended. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else in the audience? Yes, please.
Hi, Chair Carpet.
Hi.
Planning Commissioners. My name is Klaus Johansmeyer. I live on Blanding Lane, close to Park Lane. And I'm here on behalf of myself and my parents, Irene and Carl Johansmeyer.
Could you speak a little bit into the microphone so the people on Zoom can hear you?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I sent you a lot of stuff. I'm sorry it had to be so much, but we strongly believe that the categorical exemption from CEQA is inappropriate because it does not meet the criteria of negligible or no expansion of existing or former use. We've sent a bunch of concerns, most important of which is the human-caused fire danger and fire danger for Belvedere in general. We believe that $120,000 is a lot for a bench and a couple of stairs. And I don't think anyone actually believes that no additional pedestrian traffic is anticipated. And I think the wait and see approach for trash and people coming there to do whatever they do is also inappropriate because we already have a case in point at the Winifred Allen bench where people do dump trash over the rail. They smoke at the street. They smoke and throw their cigarette butts over the side. There's no smoking sign. There's no policing of all of that. And the more areas which you provide for people to hide up there in the hills or across the street from someone's front door, you know, the more problems that might develop. So we're most concerned about the fire risk. And the last meeting of the Parks and Open Space said that there would be a fire study done, but none has been done. And I just question why that is. And if there's an effort to squash that, because it would not stand to the facts. Now, it's a very steep site, high winds, and with cigarette butts being dropped, you know, you can have serious fires develop. And we have examples at the Gans lots and also at Angel Island, human-caused fire danger that burned half the island.
Mr. Johannesmeyer, so you're over your time. If you could finish up in the next 30 seconds, that'd be great.
Well, I asked that a fire study be done along with the other studies that should be done under CEQA. That's what I would ask for.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pardon? Oh, yeah, we have a question for you.
Sure.
Just a quick question. In your letter, you state that you are representing a group of neighbors who are opposing this. Could you be more specific as to who's in that group?
Well, given the history of how neighbors who have raised concerns have been treated, we don't feel comfortable disclosing that at this time.
Thank you.
Could you tell us how many maybe? Just, you know, is it 5, 10,
A
20?
handful. There's a handful of people
Handful.
living in that area, in that neighborhood, and they're concerned about their privacy and all the other issues that I communicated in the letter.
Okay, that helps us. Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak on the subject? Anyone on Zoom, Rebecca?
I see no one on Zoom.
Thank you. Mr. Boyd, did you want to answer his, the CEQA thing and the fire study? What?
So yes, we've worked with a CEQA consultant on this, and she in turn has consulted with a biologist, and we obtained an arborist report. The site, according to the biologist, is too small to be considered of environmental concern. And we do have a tree, the tree report that we have outlines some of the tree protection measures that we would put in place during construction. Regarding fire, I have reached out to the fire district and the fire marshal, who unfortunately was on vacation and, sorry, at a conference, and wasn't able to get back to me. But I can say that right now, Scotch broom is growing at the site, and that's and I know that the fire department considers that to be a brushy material that is flammable, so that would be removed. The wooden steps would be removed and replaced with concrete steps, and so from that perspective, I believe that that it would be an improvement to fire safety, and it would the improvement as an evacuation route, the improvement to the steps would be considered a positive for fire safety.
I would also like to offer something regarding the fire safety. This project will take a building permit, and we will route it to the fire department prior to building permit issuance.
Oh, okay. I was going to say maybe a condition that it be done, but if it's part of
It
the
will be
building.
done. yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, great, perfect, good. I'll bring it back to the commission to discuss. Vice Chair Johnson, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. So I'm in agreement with the staff report, and I can make the findings for this project. I think it's absolutely consistent with the owner's request for how this space should be used. I walk the island almost every day, and I personally cherish these reflection points to stop and take in the view. We also do have older community members who walk a lot, and providing a space for them to sit and rest, I think, is great and a really good use of the space. And I avail myself of these benches all over the island, and I've personally never seen any garbage, so I don't think that's an issue. And I also agree that in terms of the fire hazard, I think that these changes will really reduce the fire hazard. Right now, you've got the wood railing and some very flammable brush that's going to be removed. So I think the changes that I recommended are great, and I can make all the findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Burke?
I agree with Vice Chair Johnson on all of her comments. I can also make the findings for this project, and I appreciate the work that the Parks and Open Space and Lanes Committee has already put into this and the thoughtful analysis that staff has done. So again, I can make the findings.
Thank you. Commissioner Slaymaker?
I also agree with my fellow commissioners. I guess my only question would be investing money into the landscaping without irrigation. So I guess my question would be just researching a little more, because I would hate to put some great landscaping in and then not be able to water it. So that's my only, otherwise I can make the findings.
They'll be bringing their final landscaping plans back once, yeah. Thank you. Commissioner Seidel?
I agree with my fellow commissioners on this. I'll be able to make the findings in favor of this project. I think it's very important for the city to maintain these lanes in very safe, durable conditions. So that's one aspect of this that I appreciate. But there's also a very nice design going on here that I think will be an improvement to the experience. I like the curving stair. I do have one comment on the landscaping also. If it's helpful, I heard 5 or 6 different shrubs that could be screening behind the bench. One of them was privet. Privet I think of as a fairly structured kind of clipped hedge, and I'd be in favor of something that's a loose form that looks natural. So I just thought I'd share that.
Thank you. Commissioner Hart?
Yes, here's another yes vote, and that I agree with my fellow commissioners. And I must say, I also like the curved design. And I must say, I had no idea it had been in the pipeline for this long to be built. But I'm happy for the Parks and Open Space Committee that they finally get something done, so to say. I also thinking about the newly planted, whenever it will be planted, that the neighbor to the north, who is under construction and has just planted their stuff, they might be very generous, and as they have to maintain their newly planted material, they might be very willing to just extend a few lines down for the time it takes to establish these plants, which is probably about one summer, and that then they're going to all be on their own. And I agree with Commissioner Seidel that, yeah, I think a more bushy natural plant behind the bench should probably be considered. So my vote, yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Lasky?
Yes, I agree with my fellow commissioners also. I also like the curved stairs. I think that's really nice. It's a very nature's way of moving up the stairs. And as I mentioned, I've really never seen any trash, and there's also very little parking there. If people are just going to park and go sit on a bench, I don't think they're going to go up and spend the time going up the stairs. But I also was thinking that perhaps the neighbor might contribute some water for them. And if the plants go in the winter soon, then they get rain and they get set in. And so they're kind of set for the year. So I think that's very helpful to do them when it's raining. But I can make all the findings also.
Thank you. And without further delay, I can make all the findings for design review. And so maybe we please have a motion?
One thing I forgot to mention, it would be really great to have Roger Felton touch up some of the signs, this one in particular. It's a shame to put all this work into it and then not also rehab the sign, which is lovely. So I would ask him to do that. And if he can go around touching them up, that would be great. Thank you.
Roger Felton is not the artist of all of them. He asks other friends and artists on the island or children to do them, but I'm sure he can find who the original artist is and ask them to do it.
Okay, and with that, may I have a motion, please?
I move to adopt the resolution granting design review for replacement of the existing wood steps with concrete steps and approval of a new landing and concrete bench.
I second.
Congratulations to the applicant. No coyote bush. Okay, moving on to agenda item 4, our revised housing element.
I'll kick it off here. Good evening, Chair Carapiet and Planning Commissioners. I would like to introduce you to Andrew Hill, who is sort of getting situated right now from Diet and Batia. He is the City of Belvedere's planning consultant who has been working very hard along with his team and the Housing Element Committee to revise our housing element in response to the letter that we received from HCD in May. And with that, Andrew will take it away.
There we are. Good evening. As Rebecca said, my name is Andrew Hill. I'm with Diet and Batia, the planning and design firm that's assisting the city. So in January of this year, the City Council adopted the 6th cycle housing element and sent it up to the state for the legally mandated 90-day review period. That review period ended in May, and when it closed, the state sent back a letter identifying a series of revisions that they say are needed for compliance with California housing element law. In the summer, the city engaged my firm to assist with those revisions. And we have worked through the fall to collect additional data, to do additional analysis, and to make those revisions. We released a public review draft of the revisions on November 3rd, and we conducted a community workshop on November 9th to introduce the revisions to the community and receive feedback. And that brings us to the study session here tonight. So the objectives for this study session tonight are to introduce the revised element to the Planning Commission and the community, and to hear feedback about the content before moving into formal hearings for adoption in December and January. So in my presentation tonight, I'd like to touch on the legal requirements for the housing element, to provide an overview of the content of the revised element, and then to open it up for questions and comments. And I'll close with a look ahead to some of the next steps in the process. So let's start with some of the housing element requirements. The housing element is one of 8 state mandated elements of the general plan. Essentially, it's the city's plan for addressing local housing needs. Unlike other elements of the general plan, it must be updated every 8 years to plan for the coming 8-year housing cycle. And also, unlike other elements of the general plan, it's subject to a whole host of legal requirements, including that the California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, review and certify the element as compliant with state law. So there are several key components of the housing element. First and foremost among them is an inventory of sites that are available for housing. That's usually shown on a map, and it's accompanied by a table that has the capacity projections for each site on the inventory. Additionally, the housing element has to include some background information, including an assessment of local housing needs that's based on census data, an assessment of various constraints to housing, whether they're environmental constraints, market-based constraints, or regulatory constraints. And it also has to include an assessment of any fair housing issues. And by that, we mean any issues that would present fair and equal access for all members of the community, regardless of income or ability or ethnic background. And then the final key component of the housing element is a program of implementing actions that address those local housing needs, address those constraints, and address any fair housing issues that were identified in the analysis, and also facilitate build out of the inventory. So a term you hear a lot in the context of housing elements is RHNA. It stands for the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. It's essentially the total number of new housing units that the city must plan to accommodate over the next 8 years. Now, RHNA is separated into 4 income categories that correspond to the area median income in Marin County. So households that make less than 50% of the area median income are considered very low income, and households making more than 120% of the area median income are considered above moderate. So this chart shows Belvedere's allocation for the upcoming 8-year cycle. It's for a total of 160 units, and those are broken out by the various income categories, as you can see here. So another important thing to remember in the context of legal requirements for the housing element is that every city in California is required to adopt a housing element that complies with state law. And failure to do so can result in fines and penalties. These can include the loss of funding for transportation improvements and other state-funded projects. It can include court-imposed fines of up to $600,000 a month. And it can also lead to lawsuits that can result in the loss of local control over zoning and project approvals, or can even result in a court-mandated compliance, including completion of the housing element by a court appointee. So let me walk you now through the content of the revised element. The revisions that have been made really respond to the comments that are in that May letter from HCD. And they include a thorough evaluation of the effectiveness of the programs in the prior housing element, and that's contained in Appendix E. Incorporation of some additional data and analysis regarding the assessment of fair housing conditions, and that's contained in Appendix D. Some additional analysis of government and non-governmental constraints on housing, which is included in Appendix C. And then revisions to the sites inventory and revisions to the implementing programs that are contained in Chapter 4. And those last 2 components are really the heart of the housing element. So that's where I'm going to focus most of my presentation tonight. So starting with the sites inventory, state law requires that all cities zone for adequate capacity to meet their RENA requirements. And the sites inventory is really the mechanism by which you demonstrate compliance with that legal requirement. It's important to note here, though, that the city is not required to build those 160 units of housing. The only requirement is for the city to demonstrate that the zoning map has adequate capacity to accommodate those units if individual property owners choose to build them. So additionally, another legal requirement to keep in mind is that state law establishes some specific criteria for sites that are identified to meet lower income RENA. These include site size parameters. So sites identified for lower income need to be at least a ½ acre in size and not more than 10 acres in size. They need to be free of environmental constraints, close to transit. They need to have adequate infrastructure serving them, and they need to be distributed throughout the community. And the reason the state has established those criteria for lower income sites is to try to ensure that communities are putting forward their most shovel-ready sites to meet the lower income requirements, and because of the financial feasibility challenges around affordable housing. However, in Belvedere's case, there are so few sites that meet those criteria, it's a big challenge to demonstrate that. And so one of the best ways that we can put forward to demonstrate realistic capacity is to rely on property owner interest. And so you'll hear me talk about that a bit in the presentation tonight. So let me walk you through some of our assumptions for the inventory. First, projects that are in review, under construction, or likely to receive a certificate of occupancy in the coming 8 years can be counted towards RENA. And so there are 2 projects currently, 2 single-family projects that have either been approved or under construction, and those are both counted towards the RENA. Additionally, the revised housing element assumes that the Mallard Point project will move forward, and the 18 net new units there have been counted towards the RENA as well. There are not many vacant parcels in Belvedere, but there are 9 that currently have zoning that permits housing. And so the element has assumed that those are available for housing, and those 9 units, so 1 unit per each of those properties, has been counted as well towards the RENA. And then accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units can be counted towards the RENA. State law establishes a particular guidance on that topic. It allows the city to look at the total number of ADUs that have been construction permits that were issued for ADUs since 2018, to look at that number, the annual average, and then project it forward for each year of the planning period. So if we look in Belvedere's case, since 2018, the city has permitted about 2.8 ADUs per year since 2018. And so we can project forward at least 24 units over the next 8 years. However, state law also says that that's a minimum, recognizing that trends throughout the state, ADUs are increasing, and particularly here in Belvedere, there's strong interest. And so we've incorporated in Chapter 4 a suite of programs to facilitate and incentivize ADU construction. And on that basis, we're projecting a total of 40 over the planning period. And then additionally, the Belvedere Land Company has expressed interest in renovating 2 multifamily properties that it owns and adding some units there. And so these properties are 500 San Rafael and 6 Community Road. A letter of interest from the Belvedere Land Company has expressed interest in developing 8 new units at 500 San Rafael and 3 new units at 6 Community. And this is possible under current zoning, and so those units have also been counted towards the RENA. So in total, through these strategies, we've illustrated capacity for 80 new units under current zoning. Now that's about halfway to the 160, but not all of the way there. And so therefore, because it's not quite enough, we've had to think about some rezoning strategies to create that additional capacity to get to the 160 number. And so in broad terms, there's three rezoning strategies. The first of them is to create a mixed-use zoning district around the Boardwalk Shopping Center. The second is to increase capacity in areas that are already zoned for multifamily housing. And then the third one is to create a zoning overlay applicable to church sites that would allow them to develop multifamily housing on their properties if they choose. And so let me talk in a little bit more detail about each of those strategies, starting with the Boardwalk. So this first strategy really focuses on facilitating mixed-use development at the shopping center. The property owner, Belvedere Land Company, has expressed interest in modernizing the center and adding housing to help address local needs. Mixed use here is consistent with Goal 9 in the general plan, which describes a vision for mixed use and infill housing in the area. And Tiburon's housing element, because the Boardwalk is half in Tiburon, Tiburon's housing element, which has been certified by the state, does envision mixed use and housing development on its portion of the parcel. And so the revised element includes Program 2D, under which the city of Belvedere would adopt new zoning that creates a mixed use district, permitting between 30 and 35 dwelling units per acre on the site, allowing up to 3 stories, buildings up to 3 stories, and incorporating requirements for setbacks and upper story setbacks where adjacent to existing housing. These parameters mirror what's in Tiburon's housing element and the zoning that they've proposed. And so on this basis, we're projecting 65 units at the Boardwalk site. And then additionally, as you can see on the map here, there's 3 other properties that are adjacent to the Boardwalk under different ownership, so not owned by the Belvedere Land Company, but adjacent, that potentially represent opportunities for housing as well. And so through Program 2E in the revised element, the city would also apply that new mixed-use zoning district to those 3 parcels to give the owners the option to develop housing on those parcels if they wish. And then additionally, this Program 2E includes some incentives that are intended to encourage consolidation of the sites to allow for more holistic planning over the area. These incentives could include parking reductions, setback adjustments, or relaxed open space requirements. And these incentives would be available only if 2 or more parcels were combined. And so the idea is to encourage consolidation of the lots to allow for more holistic planning and development. The second strategy, the second rezoning strategy here involves increasing capacity in areas where multifamily residential housing is already allowed. And this is rather than trying to find new sites and rezone them to look at where it's already allowed and increase the capacity. So the strategy focuses really on 2 clusters of parcels around the lagoon that are located in the planned unit development overlay. Now, recognizing that multifamily housing around the lagoon is aging and in need of renovation, the general plan established this planned unit development overlay to permit unique design and development solutions in exchange for public benefits. So picking up on this concept, this strategy would offer zoning incentives to allow for additional units on the sites, but only in exchange for a commitment to make some of those units available for affordable for members of the local workforce. So specifically, these incentives could include permitting the density to be calculated over the whole of the area of contiguous parcels under common ownership. And so for both of these clusters are owned by the Belvedere Land Company. One cluster is of 9 parcels and the other cluster is of 5 parcels. So if that 9 parcel cluster or that 5 parcel cluster was developed together, the density could be calculated over the whole of the area. Another incentive proposed would be increasing the maximum lot coverage from the current 40% to 45%, and reducing parking requirements from the current 2 spaces per unit to 1 space per unit and a half space of common or guest parking per unit. And also reducing open space requirements to 150 square feet per unit in view of the proximity of the existing park that's within 1,000 feet of both of these parcels. And then another incentive would be permitting an extra 2 feet of building height only on properties that front Beach Road. That would mean that the maximum height allowed along Beach Road would be 38, which would allow for an additional story on some of those properties. So these are adjustments to the zoning that would be made, again, only in exchange for a commitment to make a portion of those units affordable to lower income households as a way of helping Belvedere achieve its lower income RHNA obligations. So really the intent is to create capacity in exchange for units that can be counted towards lower income RHNA. And then the third strategy involves facilitating affordable housing on church properties if owners would like to pursue that option. There are 2 church properties here in Belvedere, and so the strategy would apply to both of them. There is new state law that already provides incentives for churches to build affordable housing, and Program 2H in the revised element would provide technical assistance and development support to the churches if they decide to pursue the option of building housing. And another point of importance here is we've incorporated Program 1A, which is around inclusionary requirements. So all of these incentives would increase capacity. Just building more housing doesn't necessarily get you to your lower income RHNA obligation. And so the idea here is to make a requirement for projects over a certain size to dedicate a certain percentage of the units towards lower or moderate income households. This is a strategy that many communities, at least a half a dozen in Marin County, have employed. Some of them are shown here on the screen. The proposal in the revised element now is that any project proposing 3 or more units would be required to make 20% of the units affordable to households making less than 80% of the AMI. So with the implementation of those 3 overarching rezoning strategies and Program 1A, the inclusionary requirements, the inventory demonstrates a capacity for 231 new units, which is sufficient to meet the city's RHNA obligations at all income levels with a buffer. And that buffer is important to help the city navigate the no net loss provisions of state law, which say that if any individual projects don't develop at the densities that are assumed in the housing element, there's enough buffer to cover it, and the city doesn't have to scramble to rezone to make sure that the zoning map always has the capacity to meet RHNA obligations. The Chapter 4 of the revised element also includes a number of strategies that are intended to increase the range of housing types available in Belvedere and expand opportunities for people of all income backgrounds in Belvedere. These are strategies that HCD refers to as housing mobility, a little bit of a wonky term, but essentially that means expanding opportunities for people of all economic backgrounds. And so one of the strategies that's incorporated in the revised element is the creation of an SB 10 overlay. SB 10 is a new state law that would allow, it's essentially the idea of creating smaller multifamily housing opportunities. It would allow up to 10 units on an individual lot. And so the map on the right of the screen is showing some potential candidates that could receive this SB 10 overlay. Part of the SB 10 overlay would include a requirement that some of the units be made affordable to lower and moderate income households, again, as a strategy to to help the city offer this zoning incentive in exchange for a commitment to affordability to help the city meet its RENA obligations at all income levels. In total, if all of these sites were built out, it would create capacity for 200 units. That's not going to happen. We've assumed that only a small portion, 10% of that total capacity, might be available. Another housing mobility strategy is to create a co-housing overlay. Co-housing is a concept that involves private homes, individuals having private homes, but living in close proximity, maybe with some shared facilities like a shared kitchen, people might eat together. And so co-housing can be a strategy for allowing older adults to age in place and live together, live independently longer. And it's a strategy that's been used in a number of communities here in the Bay Area, including in Berkeley. There's a co-housing community in Mountain View, and there's one planned in Novato as well. And again, this is a strategy to increase the range and type of housing opportunities available in Belvedere. It's important because we know in the HCD letter of May, they're looking for strategies to increase that range of housing choices beyond just RENA capacity. And so that's why we felt it's important to include this type of strategy. Another strategy for, again, for housing mobility would be to create a workforce housing fund. This is something that the city would work with together with other foundations or nonprofit groups in the community to raise funds to support the construction or the provision of affordable housing units in the community. And so that's been included as program 3D in the revised element. So that was a lot. We'll come back for questions if you have it. But as I said, we released the revised element on November 3rd, and we did have a community meeting. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about that event. It was held here in City Hall downstairs in the community room on November 9th. And it was quite well attended. We had over 50 people come, and I think it was very helpful for giving people the opportunity just to start to learn about the housing element before we move into formal hearings. The event was organized with different stations around the room. Each station had a display board with explaining different aspects of the element, including the strategy for these strategies that I was talking about, and some of the legal requirements for the element. Each station had a staff member there who would answer questions and help people get familiar with the content. And then everyone had an opportunity to leave comments as well after they'd had a chance to absorb some of the materials. And so station number 3 really dealt with ADUs. And what we heard there is that residents were quite interested in ADUs, and they were looking for clarity on who's eligible and what the requirements are. And they were the program in the element around raising awareness in the community and providing technical assistance for interested homeowners in particular was a popular one. Station 4 was about mixed use development around the boardwalk. We heard that generally people thought that if there was a location for multifamily housing in Belvedere, that was probably the best location for it. But we did hear concerns about traffic, about emergency access, the difficulty of multiple different owners in the area, and then overall, the cost of living and what the price of those new units would be. The station 5 was about that PUD overlay strategy, so there was, I think the people really had an opportunity to ask a lot of questions and appreciated the information on the board. They did express concerns about reducing parking in that location. Really, having a car is important for getting around this area of Marin County, so there was some hesitation there. And then the 6th station was about those housing mobility strategies. And really, this was another good opportunity for people to ask a lot of questions and start to understand more about what those strategies meant. One thing I will say that we heard really as an overarching comment from the community is that people in Belvedere really value the design of the community, the thought that went into the structuring of where density is and that kind of thing. And so one suggested revision is displayed here on the screen. As I mentioned, we have the program 1A, which is about those inclusionary requirements. And in the revised draft that's currently out for public review, the requirement is that is for 20% of in any project with 3 or more units, the owner make 20% of those units available for lower income RHNA. And that mirrors what other communities in Marin County have done. However, it's different than what Tiburon has done. Tiburon has done only 15%. And so there was some feedback that maybe it's better to mirror what Tiburon's done. And so that's what's being shown here. And then similarly in program 2F, the affordability requirement would be reduced to mirror 1A, so 15% instead of 20%. Making this change would reduce the projection for lower income RHNA, but we would still have enough to demonstrate that we're meeting the RHNA requirements with a buffer. So this would be fine. So let me just quickly wrap up then with next steps. We're going to open it up for questions and for comments. We'd really like to hear from you all if these revisions appropriately address the comments that were received in that May letter from HCD, and if you have any other suggestions for refinements or modifications that should be made before we move into formal hearings that are scheduled for December and January. So yeah, and then in terms of next steps, one thing that's in process now is a vehicle miles traveled study. This is required for environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act. It's a pretty complicated process involving a regional model. They're scheduled to have it completed by the end of November, and assuming that gets done, we'll be able to release the environmental document early in December and have the public review period for that document done in time for a planning commission hearing later in December. So just a quick look ahead to the next steps, but happy to take any questions or comments you might have now.
Any questions for the consultant? Vice Chair Johnson.
Thank you. That was very thorough and very helpful, so thank you. So I have a few questions. You're going to ask me for a page number, and I unfortunately didn't write it down, but in one section in here, it indicates that the inclusionary housing requirement would not apply to certain areas. Could you just clarify for me which areas it would not apply to?
I think it's actually the inclusionary hire requirement in program 1A would apply to any project that involves more than 3 units. So rather than a geographic limitation, it's a project size limitation. Is that what you're thinking of?
Well, so I found the page.
Oh, okay.
4-6. It just at the kind of in the middle of the page. Okay, so that was my question. So is it just the boardwalk, that new mixed use zone?
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And then at one point, the church here was applying for historic designation, and I wonder if that would impact our ability to use that site in the housing element. And if they did in fact get that status, I don't know.
No, they did not get that status, and the property is up for sale,
And nor do we have an application.
nor do we have an application for historic.
Would someone be precluded from doing that if it's been identified as a potential site for, I'm just wondering if there's a conflict there with.
So correct me if I'm incorrect, but is it not the owner who makes the decision to apply for historic designation?
I believe that's correct under your ordinance, and in any event, it wouldn't interfere with the housing rezoning, the housing program.
It's
So
a
can I just get one clarification? Because I don't know if I heard her right and you answered to her question. So the inclusionary is for any project in the city that has 3 units or more,
correct
not over 3, 3 units or more.
correct.
And then would include R2, R3,
But not boardwalk.
and the boardwalk.
Okay, then.
I
Does
think
it-
the boardwalk is a carve out though, because
Yes, yes, I think that's maybe what's what I'm understanding.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's the
the
confusion.
inclusionary requirement applies citywide, except there's a carve out for the boardwalk. And the way the reason it's constructed that way now is because the way it's written now, program 1A has that 20% requirement for any project of 3 units or more, which is different than what Tiburon has done. And so if we were to apply that 20% requirement to half of the site, and Tiburon has a different requirement, it just becomes very complex. And so, yes, thank you for pointing that out. Well, that's what's being done is that it's a carve out for the boardwalk, recognizing that complexity. So I'm sorry, I didn't pick up on what you were asking. But
Okay,
that's the answer.
okay.
No, wait, I'm sorry, Ashley.
Yeah.
Because I'm confused now. So are you saying that you're talking about 20% in the R2 and R3 zones? And what you had up there on 1A, reducing it to 15% is just, you're talking about the mixed use zone for the boardwalk and the 7 Beach and 15 Cove Place?
Right. So there's a few things happening here. As in the draft that was released on November 3rd, program 1A put in this inclusionary requirement for any project of 3 or more units to make 20% of them available to lower income households. And because of that requirement, we had a carve out for the boardwalk because of that complexity that I was saying. If we make these revisions that are up on the screen here, then the citywide inclusionary becomes 15 and there's no need for a carve out.
Okay, all right. That's clarity. We got it.
Sorry, it's a very
sorry to
complex.
interrupt,
No, no,
but,
no, thank you, that was helpful.
I don't want to go
Um,
down the road and be confused.
Okay, so if a building pays the in lieu fee instead of actually building the units, are they still entitled or eligible for the additional density and all of the
Yes.
height? So they're still, okay,
Yes.
okay. And then I had a question about policy 2.7, which is the by right zoning for multi-unit housing with the affordability requirement. So it indicates that a project that meets that requirement would be automatically exempt from CEQA. And so same question again, if they paid the in lieu fee instead of actually building the units, would that exemption still apply, that CEQA exemption?
Which page are you looking at? I'm sorry.
What page is what policy are you looking at,
Okay,
please?
2.7.
That's the page.
Sorry, policy 2.7, 4-3. I mention it because in automatic exemption concerns me in the context of Mallard Point specifically. I think Mallard Point shares a lot of the features. It's in the same area, it's on the lagoon. Some of the areas we've indicated here for development are on the lagoon, and then on the other side, they're on Beach Road, which is a failing road. So these areas would face many of the same questions and environmental sort of sensitivities that have come up around Mallard Point. And I just don't want to be in a position where our hands are tied down the road when it shares many of the same geographical concerns and environmental concerns.
I can offer partial but not complete comfort on that score. The exemption that we're talking about is refers to the fact that a project that is not discretionary is not subject to CEQA, and therefore it's exempt. And by right zoning essentially means that the project is non-discretionary and therefore not subject to CEQA. So the inclusionary housing ordinance that you mentioned earlier doesn't really have much to do with this. It's the operation of state law and how it defines by right zoning. So where the city is required to have by right zoning, CEQA would not apply. And Andrew, you may want to expand on that a little bit. I'm speaking in general terms, of course.
Do we have to have by right?
To some degree, yes.
And is it just for the projects that were in our last housing element?
It's for projects that are subject to SB 35.
Yes.
SB 35
Which
only?
is basically your lower income projects.
So can we say that?
I think
Yes.
that's.
I mean,
things
can we
would
clarify that in
Yes,
there,
yes,
that
we
this
can do
is,
that. Yes.
because she's correct. Thank you, Ashley. It's, you know, it's, as we have said, words matter. And so I think the clearer we can be in this, that we don't have conflicts going down the road when we're specific about what we're talking about. Continue, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you. So the sites for SB 10, were those selected because of their size or because of property owner interest?
Actually, they were selected because, so we looked at something called the assessed value ratio, which is the value of the land in relation to the value of the buildings and the structures on it. And when the land is worth relatively more than the buildings and structures, that means there's a potential incentive for the property owner to want to redevelop, you know, with another use that could command a higher rent or a sales price. So the idea is that that's an indicator of redevelopment potential. And so it seemed like those were potential candidates for redevelopment. It doesn't make sense to apply an SB 10 overlay over a housing site that's clearly not going to redevelop. The idea was to try and identify where development is most likely to happen and put in place this housing mobility strategy on those locations.
And I think, speaking as a member of the task force, is that we were also looking at that majority of the housing is focused down in the flatlands around the lagoon and Beach Road. And, you know, that there could be somebody up on the island with vacant land that may choose to develop at a higher density, and thereby for HCD, they see that we're diversifying our housing throughout the city, and it's not concentrated just down in the flatlands. And it's not forced upon
Okay.
the homeowner. It's an option if
Are
they
they
want
aware
to
that
choose
they're
it.
in here? Okay.
We haven't sent them letters, no.
Yeah, okay.
But I have one question on SB 10, just so that we're not back and forth a bunch of times. I didn't realize that, where does the 25 and my notes are all screwed up, but where does the 25 and 5% come in? I mean, does the 25 and the 5 add up to 30 on the SB 10, that they have to have 25 low and 5% moderate? Is that state law or is that
No,
something?
that's something that was added as a way of trying to, so just increasing the capacity doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get lower income units. Right. And so the strategy here again is to offer these zoning incentives, but only in exchange for that commitment to affordability to help the city meet its low and its moderate income units. And so this requirement, it's essentially building in an inclusionary requirement into the SB 10 ordinance to do that sort of exchange, offer a zoning incentive in exchange for a commitment to affordability.
And I just want to point out to the commissioners that you got a density bonus chart email today. And if we do 30%, which the SB 10 would qualify for, they get 50% bonus density. Okay, go ahead, Ashley.
Okay, I'm gonna, I think, stop there. A couple of small things. There may be a rationale for separating out the policy and the program in here. I like having them together. I think it's really nice to have that, to have it go kind of sequentially, because you're telling a story and then you're following up with the policy. So I think just a small thing. And then it would also be great to have somewhere maybe upfront before we get into the actual programs and policies, an updated zoning map for people, just to indicate the new areas, you know, the new or mixed use zone, where we're going to have changes to the PUD overlay, just to kind of visualize it for people.
Right. I think the intent was to have that in chapter 3,
Okay.
but maybe a reference back to it might be helpful.
I kept wanting to look at it as I was reading, so I think it's nice to have it.
Okay.
Another just small thing, a couple of the pictures in the back where we're showing different parcels, their pictures have been duplicated. So I think we just need to check
Okay.
that we've,
Mhm.
yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Kevin?
I want to go, thank you for all of the work that you've done. I know that we brought you in to evolve this, and it's evolved quite a bit, and I think in a very good way. Couple of questions for you, though, is I want to go to what you're calling the 2 clusters and just push on that. What is the advantage? I mean, I'm not a big fan of rezoning. I think they're zoned R2 and R3 for a reason. But what is the advantage of treating them as a cluster versus leaving them zoned the way that they are? And or is there another way to treat those clusters? So why couldn't you have a R2 cluster and an R3 cluster versus just pushing everything together?
Right. So we have in mind our RENA obligations at all the different income levels. And as I mentioned, it's a big challenge for Belvedere to meet those lower income RENA obligations because there really aren't very many sites that meet those criteria, right? When you think about size alone. And so we come back to property owner interest as being our best way of demonstrating. And we know that the Belvedere Land Company has expressed interest in renovating those properties and adding housing. Those properties are already identified in the general plan as appropriate locations within Belvedere for multifamily housing. So rather than trying to find other parcels to rezone for multifamily housing, to focus on those areas. And the strategy would be to try and create enough capacity to demonstrate that, you know, there's enough to get to the lower income RENA requirement. If we were to only allow for these zoning incentives over R3 parcels, I would have to run the numbers again, but we're reducing that. We're definitely reducing the buffer, and there's a question of whether we even get to the numbers because there's less land to work with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think we should run the numbers. I mean, I know that we're at 9%, our buffer is only 9% for low income. So you're right, maybe it doesn't, but I do think that we should run the numbers because again, I mean, personally, I'm not in favor of rezoning zones that have been thoughtfully, zoned as they are. Another question.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Yeah. So if we were to go that strategy and just focus on the R3, not the R2, but only the R3, if we run the numbers and doing that doesn't get us to our RENA obligations with a buffer, should we look at increasing the capacity just within the R3? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you could, because again, it's already R3, or you could look for other sources. I mean, we could go back and sharpen our pencils and see if there is yet any other opportunities for us to meet those numbers or to just create a buffer that we all feel comfortable with without rezoning. The second question is, if we are exploring this idea of, for instance, developing these inclusionary housing ordinance that gives a developer some, benefit if they have 15% or 20% affordable housing. How does that relate to the state density bonus law and which one would prevail? Because I mean, obviously the minimum there is 10% or it goes 10, 20, the steps are different.
Yeah.
And so how do you square those two?
Yeah. So they are additive. We would be offering these incentives. And then if they qualified, they could also go above, they could add state density bonus on top of that. So that's another reason I showed you the revisions to the inclusionary requirements here. That's another reason for reducing it because the 15% it triggers a smaller state density bonus, but not to the same level. So it's a way of limiting it. So that would be another advantage of reducing. But at the end of the day, they are additive. in the case of the boardwalk site, it is, in order to get a streamlined review on the boardwalk site and with the density bonus, they would need to pay prevailing wages. Which is a big cost, a big bump in the costs, and is often prohibitive. So oftentimes developers, talking to developers here in Marin County, they say that a project can't pencil out if you have to pay prevailing wage. And so on the boardwalk site, that would be a disincentive for using state density bonus, if you're following me. So it theoretically, while it would be possible to add state density bonus on top of it, in terms of financial feasibility of the project, it probably wouldn't pencil out if they did that. So it wouldn't happen.
But couldn't they use SB 330?
For streamlining, yes.
Well,
but-
for the bonus density and height and setbacks and waivers and conditions, I should say, or
Mhm.
concessions and waivers. They would have unlimited waivers, and depending on where they're at, one or more concessions. So that would be on top. So we've been down this road, and the easiest thing for me was to use numbers to understand what he's saying. So if you take a 1 acre site, we'll say in the R2 zone, doesn't matter, R2, R3, they're same, but different. The R2 zone, 20 units per acre, they get 20 units. If they do, and of that 20 units, 15% or 2 units would be low income. And because they did 15%, they would get a bonus density of 27.5, which would work out to 6 units per acre. So it would be another fourplex and triplex to each 1 acre site.
Right, but they could also just rely on the state density bonus law and deliver 10% and use concessions and waivers to potentially.
But if we do inclusionary, they have to do 15.
So
And
inclusionary
yeah,
requires-
and they
so
don't
that
ha-
trumps the-
yeah, it trumps.
It does.
Yeah, it trumps.
Okay.
It's a bad word, I know, but it trumps. Coyote bushes are just as bad.
If I may speak to your question earlier, those units in the clusters, I believe, are not really governed currently by the R2 zone. I believe they're governed by the PUD. And-
No, that's incorrect.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's governed by the underlying zone,
But
correct?
it's also a PUD zone currently. It is R2 and R3, and it's also additionally in our zoning ordinance, they are a PUD.
And right now, I think that the reason why they're the same is because the PUD just
doesn't have
defaults
anything.
to the underlying zoning.
Right.
Yeah.
So that could be changed because they are in a PUD currently.
The whole point of the PUD is to allow you to set different development standards.
It doesn't right now, but it could.
It could,
Mhm.
but it doesn't.
But it doesn't. But they could. We'd
Right.
have to change it. There's a lot of stuff in the PUD.
Going to attachment A, page A18, where you're discussing 500 San Rafael Avenue, which is part of the site inventory. Can you talk a little bit about how you get 8 more units out of this site? It's R2, and I believe it has 4 duplexes with 2 units each, which is 8. And I believe you're suggesting it could have 16.
Yes, I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but I have an urban designer who looked at the zoning and all of these sites and did the calculations to understand what you can get under the current zoning envelope. And the answer was at 5, you could get 8 additional units there.
Okay,
So-
I'd love to see that.
So it's like 0.85 net acres. And so you can get 20 units. So it's not quite 20, so it's probably 16, like he says, if you do the
I
0.85.
think maybe it would, I think it would involve some demolition on the site. It's not just adding those units, but the point is the zoning envelope would
yeah.
allow.
Okay, well, I'd love to see it because I mean, it's 5 to 20, so And again, I mean, you have to deal with the space that you have. It's zoned for duplexes. And so I just don't
We could do
know
that. Yeah.
if it would fit. I just don't see how you could get 16 or 8 duplexes on that piece
Okay.
of land.
So if somebody comes in under our odds, our new odds allows duplexes, townhomes, and a fourplex.
But the odds apply only to sites over
But they
2
would,
acres. in
that's
size.
for a project that comes in under odds.
Oh. But the odds only apply on sites over 2 acres in size. As written now.
No,
No? I think it's,
no. No.
okay.
All right, while you're checking that, I have the same question about 6 Community Road for the same reasons. And this is where Commissioner Johnson, that image is incorrect on A20. So it was hard to eyeball it, but I would like to see how you can physically fit that number of additional duplexes on that piece of land. And these are just questions and comments. We're not trying to resolve these all here.
Well, it's just 3 extra units.
Correct.
Right.
Why don't I have other comments that are more detail oriented. Those are sort of the bigger picture comments I have. I'll turn it over to the other commissioners to see if they have other thoughts.
Commissioner Slavin?
One, I mean, I have a couple of questions, but one, since we're right here, on that same venue, under the mobile home and manufacturing home part here, I actually looked up government code section 6585203 and I never could find it. So I was wondering if you could help me out with how that's going to work, or maybe that would be Rebecca. It's on page, same page, that famous 418.
Can you read the code number again, please?
Yeah, it says it's code 65852.3. By requiring that mobile homes and manufactured homes are allowed on lots zoned for single-family residential dwellings.
Yeah, it's here. I found it. In no case may a city, including a charter city, county, or city or county, apply any development standards that will have the effect of precluding manufactured homes from being installed as permanent residences.
I think the state has said we have to allow it.
It's required.
It's required. It's not an option.
Okay. That's just from that page.
Okay. I also wanted to thank you for such a,
Sorry, please go ahead.
okay. No, I just wanted to thank you for such a well-written housing update report, because it was very concise and included also very interesting history of Belvedere. So it was, and it was much more concise than we had before. And I know really how much time this has all taken over the last year and more, how this has gone on. So thank you. I had a lot of questions. Do we have to have as an incentive the reduction in parking? Because that really enables streets full of cars. And can we eliminate that?
I think so. We would want to check, there's new state law that's come online that prohibits cities from establishing minimum parking requirements in areas that are served by high frequency transit. And so we want to just double check, where, and make sure that, anyway, as conceived right now, it's an incentive. And as long as it doesn't run afoul of that new law, then it's not, we don't need to offer it as an incentive.
Because as you know, Belvedere is somewhat isolated in Marin County, and the public transportation is almost minimal. So it's very difficult. You'll never get people out of their cars. And what it does is just makes the streets full of cars. So that would be great to eliminate that. And I had a question on in lieu fees also. So those basically go into a fund to construct low-income housing, correct?
Yes.
And
yes.
also, the in lieu of will also be on every single private home now. They either have to pay a fee or put it in ADU, correct?
No,
No?
we took that out.
Oh, that's out? I thought I read that again.
I read it as well, which
Where'd you read it?
is about requiring a new.
Can you use your mic, please, Ashley?
I didn't read that.
Hold on, it's on, yeah, I did read it. I never liked it, but it's on 411, I think. No, it's not here, but I read it too. No. I read it somewhere. So Pat, you think it was taken out?
Oh, it is. It's on page 4.2. I thought we took
It's
that
on
out.
4 what?
4.2, 4-2 in the chapter 4.
Yeah, there it is.
Ah,
A 1.1 policy, yeah.
hmm.
Didn't we take that out, Andrew?
I think it was meant to be taken out. It might not have been caught, so we should edit that.
Thank you for catching that, Marcia.
Good.
I missed it.
So in the in lieu fees, the fund that they go into, who administers that and how does that work, that fund?
So it hasn't been set up yet, but it would be. In order to set it up, the city would need to do a fee study to demonstrate that there's a nexus and that the fees are reasonable. But so the city would have to, commission that study, complete it, and on the basis of that, you could implement an in lieu fee. And the ordinance which would implement the inclusionary requirement would identify the parameters for that fee along the lines of what you're saying. And you can define how the funds are used. It doesn't necessarily only have to be for the construction of new housing. It could be, for example, for the conversion of existing units towards affordable housing. It could be for the acquisition of land. You can define in the inclusionary ordinance how the fees are to be used. So there's some flexibility there.
Okay. Another question on like water resources and utilities. I can see as Marin County expands all this housing, eventually Marin County runs out of water. And so then you would just see the landscaping everywhere will suffer. So can we control that in any way?
So there are requirements for water efficient landscaping,
Right.
which are countywide. So those would apply.
Right.
So that would hopefully control.
I guess what I'm saying is if there's not enough water, people will take a shower and they won't water their plants. I'm just, maybe.
Hopefully.
Yeah, maybe. So I'm just saying that eventually, if there's so much housing and not enough water, what's going to suffer is landscaping everywhere. So we can't control that in any way.
I mean, I wonder if there's a code enforcement mechanism for that.
I think if a project came in and it complied with the MWELO, I'm forgetting what it stands for, requirements, I don't think
You can't do anything.
a code enforcement action is a condition of approval of a project is you have to water your plants. If we don't have water, we've seen it, everybody's lawns die.
Yeah, I see.
So we can hope for drought tolerant and pray for rain.
Okay.
I don't know.
And also, all this extra housing has an impact on public safety because, as you know, we only have 2 evacuation routes. And how do we, what's the impact on the quantity? And how do can we control that at all? Because there's a risk. And I mean, it's already bad at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you can't get out. So what's going to happen when we have 160 more units?
Sure, yeah.
Is there anything we could do about that? or-
Well, state law requires us to plan for the development of our RENA. The city of Belvedere did appeal its RENA allotment, and I believe the public safety issue was raised during that appeal, and the appeal was not upheld. So there, I'm afraid we have to do our best and make those units happen as best we can.
And I had a question about I was reading, which I didn't know anything about, rental assistant. So if an owner is able to pay 30% of their income for rent, the Marin Housing Authority pays the rest?
I think that, so I think the 30% is a threshold for what's considered housing burdened. So if someone's devoting more than 30% of their income to the cost of housing, they're considered rent burdened. If they're devoting more than 50% of their income, they're considered severely rent burdened. And those households qualify for funds, for rental assistance funds through countywide programs. I think that the issue is there's probably more need than there are funds available for the program. So just because you're paying more than 30% doesn't mean you qualify. I think there's means
So there's a
testing.
maximum amount in the bank, basically.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's because I was wondering up to what amount do they pay? So obviously the bank is out.
There is a limit. The housing authority does not give blank checks.
It sounded pretty good. And then also in that same housing vouchers assistance, it also said that, and there's also home ownership assistance. Has Belvedere ever applied? There's HUD grants? I don't know.
Not that I'm familiar with.
Okay.
That we have applied.
I think there might also be income requirements, right? It's probably targeted for people with lower incomes.
And one of my other questions was, with all these new policies, most of them were to be, the planning director is responsible for them. So how do we add more planning staff and pay for all of that when there is multiple policies here that have to be administered?
Yeah, I think that's a question. Well, I think there's a number of these programs that can be implemented together. Like there's a lot of these things that are about bringing the code into compliance with new state law. We can group those together and do sort of an omnibus code cleanup. So it's just a long list of small tweaks to the code to bring it in line with new state law. So what it looks like, 5 or 10 programs, it can actually all be consolidated. So there's a strategy there for for minimizing staff workload. But I think it's a situation that communities throughout California are faced with. Like these new requirements from the state mean that all the housing elements have to include this very long list of programs to be implemented over a very short period of time. I think that what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years is funding from the state that's available to local jurisdictions has really been focused on planning efforts because everyone's had to update their housing elements. I think what we'll see in the next sort of tranche of funding from the state is funding, for cities to hire more staff to implement these programs. I haven't seen it yet, but I think that's what you hear is
Because
coming.
we're also waiving many development fees as incentives. And so therefore, that's going to be less money also.
It's difficult to address that latter, but as to the former, there are other options at the city's disposal. I discussed with planning staff earlier this year the possibility of implementing a long-term planning fee. Tiburon has one, where you calculate how much all of this is costing and divide it in some equity. That would require another study, But
Mhm,
as a
mhm.
result, you could start amassing reserve accounts, both for things like big projects like housing element and also for ongoing staff costs that are associated with it.
And I think we should make the state pay.
If only we had the tools.
Yes, yes. Um, And I actually think the ADUs are going to increase even more because we're already up to 40 and we haven't really tried that hard. And I think that the ADUs will really maybe be up to 60 by the time we finish. I think that was,
Yeah, and what happens there is if ADUs get permitted, they count towards RENA. So maybe, that you've seen, I'm sure from the comment letter, the state was dubious about the last projections. We think we've strengthened that with the new programs. We think we have a good case for 40. I don't think they're gonna let us go more than that, but that doesn't mean that if 60 get built or 80 get built, that's great. They all count towards that
because
160.
I think we had 5 in the last 8 years and now we have already 22 that have been
in process. Yeah.
approved
Mhm.
and, okay, so that also shows. And reading all this, I think what we need to do is have more senior housing. It looks like the age over 85 has tripled and 30% of the people are over 65. So that's something we may want to think about in some of our housing is have some separate senior housing. And we all, know that a lot of people want to move into smaller places. So that could be something we really emphasize in some of this housing. And it always perplexed me that the state, which there's nothing we can do about it, they apply all the same criteria to every single community. And, we have to address farm worker housing where we're not near farms and all those things that seem like it just takes so much time to do all that. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I'm sure it doesn't to you either. I just wanted to end with, I really liked 318. I really liked your summary that you said Belvedere's opening up policy and zoning and backyards to enable and reflect future community needs and to welcome a diverse new residents. I think that's very nice. That's a very nice summary for everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Alex Seidel?
Yeah, I'm interested in this concept of dispersion of the below market rate units. And I guess my question is, are you convinced that we've adequately addressed that in the report? I know it must be kind of challenging in a place like Belvedere, but it seems like an important point.
Yeah, we're certainly trying with the co-housing strategy, with SB 10, with the Workforce Housing Fund. We're trying to create opportunities. Now, those housing mobility strategies aren't necessarily being projected to increase the capacity, but they're just creating more options.
Is part of it the idea that some of the larger lots on the island can be developed with multiple units and that some of those could be below market rate?
Yes, through SB 10, that's a possibility. Or even if they, it's creating a different type of housing, which opens up more possibilities. That's, I think, the goal of one of those housing mobility strategies.
And then I guess my other question, back to the boardwalk, for instance, financial feasibility aside, if someone utilized the state density bonus, you have 3-story zoning, you could end up potentially with a 4-story building there, for example.
Yes.
Okay. I think those are the only questions I have right now.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Nana?
I have had most of my questions answered by my fellow commissioners, but I have one question that Commissioner Seidel asked, that if one of the bigger lots that you have marked as potential sites on the island if they were developed in a multi-family unit and so on. But the carrot is always, oh, you don't need to have parking and so on. I mean, I don't know how often you personally drive around Belvedere, but if we start thinking about having multi-family units on any of these parcels that are up there, yeah, that is just going to create the same thing with the parking for, or the lot by the St. Stephen's Church, the parking lot there. I don't go there, but when I drive by, there isn't an inch of space available for anything but a pedestrian, because they need every little parking space for their services, for everything else they do. It's a very active church. I can't imagine more than if they did underground parking 2 stories down or whatever, that they can accommodate both living space above and then all the cars that it would bring and all the cars or the parking they need for their things. But it has been discussed. And same thing with the water, that in your report, it said something about California, or maybe it was just in Marin, no, the Bay Area, was looking at an increase of 441,000 people during this period, but that the MMWD could just up their service to 211,000 new households. And I mean, there is a disparity so big, and we're already short of water. I feel like the cart is in front of the horse, but it's nothing that you have to do or that is being discussed. It seems so hard to wrap your head around. How can we do this when there are so many things that tries to sticks in your wheels. But I do have something good to bring, and that is that I have a parcel that I know that has not been counted and has been vacant for probably ever. And it is on Belvedere Avenue, and it's just at the top of Belvedere Way on the north side. On the upside, there's a little tongue of land that the city of Belvedere sold because they were tired of keeping it up, cleaning it up of brush or whatever. And I know that a young man bought it, and it's sitting there empty and nobody does anything with it. So maybe some little gnome could build a little house for his family and cousins and call it a multiple house unit. But there is a teeny little lot there that was designated as a buildable lot.
Can I comment on that one?
Sure.
It is a teeny lot. I know because I see it every day, and it's been on the market off and on, probably 10 times, because so far it's unbuildable. So I don't know whether that's.
But I know it was sold as a buildable lot, at least in those days. So you can add that little black spot onto the map.
Good look at it. Yeah, thank you.
Kevin, thank you.
Oh, thanks. So just to reiterate, I mean, from a conceptual standpoint, the 2 things I have issue with is rezoning the clusters. I think that we should maintain our zones. And also, I question whether or not the 15% for inclusionary is necessary, given the state density bonus law would trump that or would override that at 10%. And so I'm more of the mind that it should be 10%. But that's just food for thought.
Okay.
I want to go through the matrix that captures the comments that HCD sent us and our response, because I know obviously it's important for us to try and answer them in a fulsome way so we get this thing approved. So if you'll just bear with me, if you go to the first page of the matrix down at the bottom, it's B1A. What I wonder is whether or not we've answered that fully. If you read the report, it's more of a history of Belvedere. It doesn't really get into the evolution of our zoning and initiatives over the years. And I wonder whether or not it would benefit from having something more specific to zoning and initiatives that are more specific to how the city has developed over time. So that would be one question. On B1C, in their comments, they talk about segregation and integration, access to opportunity. And I wonder if we've answered that fully or not, in your opinion.
Access to opportunity. Well, that's, so this idea about access to opportunity is what
Mobility.
these housing mobility
Right.
are trying to get at.
Yeah. So you feel that we have, I mean, and that's a fine answer.
I think, yes. What I would say is, we plan to continue the conversation with HCD informally, rather than just submitting and see what comes back. When we feel we're ready to submit again, we're going to have one or more informal meetings with them and say, we've tried to address, is this going down the right path, and get some informal confirmation. They're never over Zoom. They're never going to say 100%, yes,
Right.
this is good enough, but at least we can get a sense of where they are before we resubmit. And we have an opportunity to refine. And so these we can certainly set up a conversation with them and say, we've looked at this comment, here's the things we've done. Are we on the right track? Are we missing anything before we resubmit? So
that's great. So further on B3A, the element should demonstrate affordability based on actual sales price, rent level, or other mechanisms ensuring affordability. I didn't see that in the report. And so I wonder if that's because we can't provide it, or whether or not there's an opportunity to answer that more directly.
Well, that's what the inclusionary requirement would be. It would be a mechanism for trying to ensure the affordability.
Right.
That's one.
Right. So you think it'll address the sales price, rent levels, and so forth specifically?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You make mention of the site inventory Excel under B3B, and I'm assuming that's what's in the document itself. It's not a separate, I mean, it sounds like it's a separate document that will be sent, but it's the same content as what's already in the report.
Correct.
That's great.
The state has a form that we must use. Anyway, it's an Excel format. Everyone must use it.
Great. Moving further down, I'm at B3II. And when I read the constraints on C26, it says C constraints, page C26 for analysis. It doesn't, in my mind, specifically call out emergency shelters. It seemed like it was a different constraint. So you might want to check that.
Okay.
I also didn't know if program 3-D dealt with the same issue. It could be things are getting a little out of sequence just based on updates. The same is true for B3II, B3II. In terms of they're out of sync, or if you look back at what the constraint is, it doesn't actually apply to like low barrier navigation centers or permanent supportive housing. On B3IV, I did figure this one out. It should be C-18 instead of C-19 for your analysis. I mean, I'd confirm this. I wouldn't just take my word for it, but. And I wonder if we ever followed up with HCD. This is under B3IV. They didn't send us the list, but did we ever follow up with them and ask for it? So we can actually address it before we submit.
It's the non-compliance.
The list of, ADUs, they're going to provide a complete list of ADU non-compliance issues under a separate cover. And we said they didn't send it, but I mean, I'd suggest we ask for it so we can head it off at the pass.
Yes.
B3IV, it should be C19 instead of C21. That's true of the next one as well. And some of these are very minor, but since we're all here to do this, B4A at the bottom, there's a typo. It should be parking, not arcing. Arcing is good too. I think we have the arc here, so arcing is good. B4B is January 31st, 2024. And this, I think, goes to a question that was raised by one of my fellow commissioners, is January 31st, 2024, is this realistic? A good answer is yes, but it's my job to ask the question.
We ask them every week.
It's a challenge. So one of the biggest challenges has to do with the environmental review. right? As I mentioned, that's
Yeah.
the traffic modeling has a long lead time. It's complicated, but it's a critical path item. If that doesn't happen, then it sort of has a knock-on effect. So that's one critical path. But if the stars align and everything gets done correctly and on time, then it's a sprint, but it's doable.
It's doable. Okay. B4 CII, it should be C 2021. The next one down below that's B4 C III, it should be 13. And on this one, I wonder whether or not this really addresses the comment fully in terms of family definition. If you read what's in the analysis, it didn't, for me, feel like it was fully answering the question, but it's worth a look just to double check. The next one, I couldn't find the info in the constraints at all. So that would be a good one to check. B4D, same issue. We seem to be out of alignment with what's our response and what's in the document. B4G, same thing. The other thing under B4G, what I'd suggest, I think it's actually supposed to be C13, is where you'd find the analysis. We should be clear that our municipal code 18 applies. And so this would be for both public and private roads, because I know that's came up in a recent meeting, and I think we want to make sure that we're in alignment with that code. Let me see if there was anything else. Under C4, we're nearing the end. It says, please see analysis above. And I wasn't sure, was that an analysis above in the matrix or an analysis above in the document?
Sorry, which one is that?
So I'm on C4.
C4.
So over to the right, the response is, please see analysis above. So maybe in 2C.
Findings. Oh, I think it means in B4 and comments B4 and B5 above in this matrix. You see what I mean?
So above in the matrix.
Yes.
All right.
Although
you can help me find that later.
Yeah, B4 and B5. See, hang on. Yeah. Okay. I think we need to be more specific because there are many.
There are many
B4s.
aboves and
Yes.
belows and besides, I think.
Yep.
And then under C5A, as noted in finding B1, the element requires a complete AFFH analysis. And I wasn't sure, it then refers you to Appendix A-34, and I didn't really find that analysis there. It was more of a summary versus an analysis. So I think either you need to check that or manage
there is
expectations.
Okay, yes. Well, I think it needs to point more. Anyway, I understand.
Got it.
Yep.
Let me look. There's a few minor things in Appendix A, which we've been chatting about. Let me just look at the list to make sure it's. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of typos that I found. I'll just give those to you separately on Appendix A. But again, my other comments on A were more those two conceptual comments. And actually, I don't want to forget, there were the other two locations where I just wasn't, I'm suspicious as to whether or not they can actually be executed as indicated in the plan. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll also have some paperwork stuff, which I will send to you. We don't need to discuss that. And I'll try to hit on the points I'd like to discuss and bring up. Is there somewhere that we can embed in our programs or policies or municipal code that before we issue a demo, that we know that the project can be built on a
I'm going to have to revise. I spoke with the chair about this earlier or communicated by email, and I'm going to have to revise my advice on that somewhat. It turns out that the Ellis Act has been ruled to prevent us from conditioning the right to demolish multi-unit rental building. So where the Ellis Act applies, we can't really prohibit demolition.
No, we're talking about a project that I don't think they did an Ellis Act.
As
You mean if somebody
demolish-
comes in and does an Ellis Act?
if someone demolishes their building, that's a way of removing the housing from the rental market. So it's subject to the same limitations. We're not allowed to prohibit them from doing that. Now, if it's demolishing a single family unit, then I don't believe the Ellis Act would apply.
So does everybody know what an Ellis Act is?
I apologize. I hate to go down that road too much, but the Ellis Act essentially is a piece of legislation that prohibits local governments from enacting certain kinds of protections for tenants. And one of the main features of the Ellis Act is limits on, it limits municipalities' ability to take actions that would prevent a landlord from taking a housing unit off the rental market. So, sorry? Yes, bulldozing it would be considered taking it off the market.
So basically, they say they're going out of the business of renting. They have to pay certain fees to their tenants. And then there's also a restriction that's put on the property that it cannot be rented for at least, I think currently it's 5 years.
That sounds right.
And that if they do go back into the rental market, they have to offer it back to their original tenants at the same price for 10 years.
Yes, it can be viewed as pretty draconian.
So how does the Ellis Act, sorry, this is off subject and maybe we should do it offline, but how does the Ellis Act come into play with all these housing accountability where they're not really taking the units off the market, they're just maybe tearing them down or rehabbing them to the point someone can't live there, and then they put it back on the rental market and they offer to those who are protected the ability to come back?
I may have misunderstood. If our desire is to only allow demolition, if the property owner can prove to us that they intend to do reconstruction and they have the ability to do reconstruction, that would be a problem because they can simply take it off the market full stop. And demolition would be one way of doing that.
But does the Housing Accountability Act allow that? I thought that if it was a rental unit, they had to have the same amount of rental units in that redevelopment.
If it's a protected unit, then yes. But even then, there's some question as to whether or not that act is somehow inconsistent. I believe if it was, the more recent act would control, which would be the Housing Accountability Act. But that only applies to protected units, which would be lower income units.
Right. But I don't see why anyone who would own a property that wanted to develop it would have anything to do with the Ellis Act, because they wouldn't be able to, unless they were going to do all condos.
If they're planning to rent, and they do in fact want to offer the new building up for rental, then they're keeping the units in the market. But if they decide to just demolish and not rebuild, that would be protected by the Ellis Act because they're taking rental units off the market.
And then they would have to have their property deed restricted.
If not deed well, it would be restricted from re-rentals except with those subject to those provisions that were mentioned earlier, which are onerous.
Okay, I'll let that go. Let's see. Oh, in the PUD overlay, we talked about 20%. Now we're talking maybe 15%, but let's keep with what's in the report. And now you've added an additional 5% for moderate. So it's a total of 25. So, okay. Again, it's the numbers. I'll save the rest of my comments for later. we already covered that one. So on page 4.3, 2.8, you have to continue to conserve rental. Is there a stronger word that we could use where we want to protect our rental housing stock as part of our housing element? Other than to continue to conserve, can we use a word like outlaw, ban, something like that? Not allowed?
Mhm.
And 2.9 is along the same, where it suggests trying to protect, where why can't we require that we protect the existing housing stock? We have so few rentals in our city. I think it's important to preserve our rental stock. Then on page 410 in program 1F, you talked about increasing the maximum size for deed restricted ADUs, I believe it was, or
Mhm.
units. No, it was for ADUs. And then you talked about a transferable FAR. Can you explain to us what that means?
I think it's the idea. So I believe that the FAR so the ADU on a site doesn't count towards the total FAR of the house, but allowing for as an incentive for a homeowner that wanted to make their new unit affordable to lower income households. If they were to do that, and if they were to, if through this program they got a larger, if they got more size, that additional square footage could be applied to the main house as an incentive. So for example, if they'd maxed out their available FAR in their single family home, but they build an ADU and deed restricted so that it's affordable for lower income households, they would be eligible for increased FAR. But if they didn't use it all, they could then transfer that bonus FAR to the main house, if you see what I mean.
Put an extra story on top.
Does it make sense?
I think we would make sure that transferable floor area would be, complies with that underlining zoning district, right? So they couldn't just put something on a, third story if it exceeded the height. Whatever they're sort of banking or transferring would also have to comply with the zoning district.
Okay. And then on page 412, you talk about a land write-down. We've not discussed that. I don't know what that is. Can you explain that? It's program 1.
Yeah, I see. I actually don't know what that term means either, so I need to check.
Yeah.
Check it. I don't know what that
Okay.
means.
Yeah, it was like, what? And then on, let's see, we talked about the 2F program. It does have, I think I know what the answer to this is, but could you define it for us on page 436? Can you define universal design?
Yes, I believe it has to do with access for the disabled. I don't have a good definition at my fingertips, but I believe that's what universal design means. Visitability, yes, that's what it means. So a housing that is visible is accessible at a basic level. See there on the last sentence before program requirements.
Okay. On page C19, we talk about SROs. And we never got a definitive answer on this from our prior consultant. If somebody does an SRO, which is a single room occupancy, does that qualify for a low income unit? Since it's just a bedroom and a bath and maybe a shared kitchen and living room?
I think in order to qualify as a low, it doesn't automatically qualify. I think de facto, the price would probably put it in that range. But I think it's conceivable that there might be a market rate SRO. And so in order for something to qualify, it would need to be deed restricted, for example.
Okay. All right, that was just a question. That I can ask offline. And that can. Oh, this is a curiosity. On page C45, you have information about loans. And then you have a row that talks about denied loans. Where do you get that source of denied loans?
It is from, there is a government database that monitors
Oh.
these things.
Okay. So I think that covers my questions. So we'll open it up to the public. Has everyone gotten their answers? Okay, open it to the public. Anyone wishing to comment?
Good evening, planning commissioners. It's good to see you again, another Tuesday night. I have several observations about the housing element that I think would be helpful to address. One of the reasons why there's such an issue with Mallard Point is due to some of the inconsistencies that currently exist between the housing element, the current housing element, and your zoning, as you're aware of. You have addressed HCD's letter from September 29th, their letter of technical assistance, by referring to table C3 that has been updated from the last housing element, explicitly stating that multifamily zoning is not allowed in the R2 zoning area. However, you're now in a situation where all of the design guidelines that are specified in C4, in table C4, are going to be require either a variance or a waiver in order to meet the 20 units per acre that the R2 zoning allows for. Taking it a step further, I think you should actually think in terms of state density bonus law, which would allow a 50% bonus. So you're actually looking at 30 units per acre. I think you need to prove, it's been foisted on us. We think we've proved that you can't do duplexes at 20 units per acre, certainly not at 30 units per acre. You think otherwise. I think it's incumbent, and HCD will also think it's incumbent to prove that you can achieve the zoning densities that you have outlined. Second, I would note that table C6 is the processing time. We submitted our application 2 years ago. It's been under CEQA review for 18 months. According to table C6, we were processing time is 6 to 12 months for approvals, and a portion of that is CEQA. So consequently, I think that that table needs to be updated. Number 3, I would note that also in Appendix C, the fees are incomplete. You don't, the fees as they relate to the sewer connection, water connection, et cetera, aren't addressed. Well, check that. They're addressed. They say they're out there. They don't say what they are. Your prior housing element that you did submit last year to the state, or in January to the state, did have that information. I think it was incorrect. It should be updated. 4, I would note that you refer to the odds guidelines that have been updated. And the Opticos odds guidelines are one of the few communities that actually adopted those, because they really don't apply. And I would look at those guidelines and update them or replace them with actually ones that are practical, because I think as you go through those, you'll see that they really don't work. They were a stopgap measure, so you had something in place because of SB 9 and SB 10, but they no longer are, they should be updated. Finally, with regard to the housing elements description, programs, and policies regarding Mallard Point as a pipeline project, that those descriptions are inadequate. HCD's housing element site inventory guidebook states that jurisdictions may choose to credit sites with pending projects since the beginning of the RHNA projection period towards the RHNA, but must demonstrate that the units can be built within the remaining time period. The HCD has written a number of technical advisory letters that I believe your city and staff are familiar with, that basically say that there's consistency with the general plan and zoning, that all necessary approvals and with regard to the housing element, that you state that there's consistency with the general plan and zoning, that all necessary approvals and likely completion dates are outlined, and there is an anticipated construction schedule that can be achieved. HCD further advises municipalities relying on pipeline projects that the housing element must include programs with actions that commit to facilitating development and monitoring approvals of the projects, e.g. coordination with applicants to approve remaining entitlements, supporting funding applications, expediting approvals, and monitoring project progress, including rezoning or identification of additional sites if necessary. Your housing element draft says something much different, and you should look at the language that HCD has provided and compare it to what your housing element states, which is, frankly, city staff are in the process of confirming compliance with SB 330, including density bonus waivers and a cost concession, making CEQA exemption determination, confirming compliance with all city development standards and underlying zones, and reviewing compliance requirements associated with comments received from the BLPOA. That's not saying anything, and that's 180 degrees from what HCD is giving you direction to do. So you're not making a commitment. There's no demonstration of guaranteed approval. In fact, we know from our recent experience, there is significant opposition. If they want to count Mallard Point, and if you want to count Mallard Point, you need to go much further to ensure approval. And the last major point is related to CEQA. You've made it clear to us that the CEQA analysis, you want greater scrutiny. The CEQA analysis that's being taken is not going to provide the greater scrutiny, but if it is accepted, then that means that all projects should be able to tear off of that for approval. And that gets back to the discretionary approvals or by right approvals that you asked about earlier. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Seeing no one, anyone on Zoom, Rebecca?
Yes, I do have one person on Zoom, Jill Barnett. Jill, you should be able to speak. There you go.
Okay,
You're
thank
unmuted.
you. I'm unmuted now. I just had a question because I'm looking at an Appendix A that the units that you've added or the housing units you've added are all, a lot of them in those PDUs and the cluster area. It's all on Beach Road and don't we have a problem on Beach Road that it's sinking? So how are you adding more weight to Beach Road? What isn't, so I'm just curious how you can identify those areas as additional housing when you just, as a safety issue. That's my comment for that.
Thank you,
Does,
John.
do you have, I mean, all right.
Do you have more time? Do you have something else?
No, I just was curious as to, is anybody in agreement that you're adding more weight to Beach Road and you've already identified the fact that Beach Road is sinking? So how can that area be identified as additional housing? Isn't there a safety issue there?
I'll leave that up to our consultant to answer.
Okay, all right. Thanks.
Thank you. He thanks you too.
I can take it, I can tackle it if you'd like.
You can't see his face.
Any project would require geotechnical reports, soils reports, engineered. The city of Belvedere would not issue a building permit unless it was safe to build on those sites. And that, comes at the time of building permit. Perhaps at the planning phase as well, if we feel like we need a geotech report or a soils report or any other type of engineering.
Thank you. Anyone else, Rebecca?
I see no one else on Zoom.
Okay, close the public. Yes. You come up
go
to
to
the
the mic?
podium, sure.
This has been, I understand this is a very complex, and I'm aware that you might not know everything that would be qualifying or not for the RENA and housing policies, but Alexandra Dean, yeah, and just considering that, I don't know if you're familiar with the term like long-termism, which is like a concept of effective altruism, which serves as a primary motivation for efforts that claim to reduce existential risks to humanity in a lot of different senses. And I feel like the RENA and housing mobility incentives in general would fall into this category. And I'm just curious if it's ever been considered or brought forth as an alternative to creating housing directly on the site of Belvedere, rather than having the town and community of Belvedere be able to sponsor potentially larger and environmentally more sound community housing, affordable areas in different locations in Marin County, working with those other municipalities and towns.
I believe the state won't allow us to do that.
Yeah, every city in California has a requirement to zone to meet their RENA requirements. There have been cases, for example, in San Mateo County, where communities collectively prepare their housing elements, and in some cases, the state has allowed for sort of sharing. If one community had more capacity than another, then the other paid some funds to build housing in another community. But those are real exceptions. Currently, state law doesn't really allow for that. I will say though that there is a movement in Marin County in particular to think about ways for interjurisdictional cooperation to create more housing. And so that may well happen outside of this particular RENA process in the future. It's certainly something that other communities are thinking about.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I just feel like, looking at potentially different sites, like, I don't know, San Quentin could be reestablished as a huge, really environmentally sound and logical place to have a community center.
Yeah, I think it is a solution that could work for Marin County, but it's kind of outside of the parameters of this exercise. We have very specific, as I'm sure you've picked up on just in the course of this conversation, there's a lot of requirements and a very specific set of parameters and rules that we have to abide by for this exercise. But that doesn't mean that your idea is a good one, sort of longer term, bigger picture.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the explanation.
Thank you. Seeing no one else, I'll close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission to discuss. Vice Chair Johnson, you want to lead off?
Yeah, thank you. So I appreciate all the time that has gone into this. To me, this is just a much more coherent and cohesive draft than what I saw many months ago and recently. So thank you for all the community input, the staff, all the work that's gone into this. So I mean, I understand we're in a position where we have to adopt an updated housing element that's in line with the state requirements, and otherwise we face potentially severe penalties. At this point, I think I'm not sure what other changes I would advocate for other than what we have discussed here tonight already. To me, this is really an exercise in implementation. This is really just how are we going to implement state law in a way that's compliant. So there's very little discretion here. I am, I'm supportive of housing policies and programs that encourage and facilitate more affordable housing. But I do have broad concerns about the state's approach to addressing the housing crisis, some of which my fellow commissioners have already mentioned. So I think it's disconcerting to see an indiscriminate, myopic approach to housing needs in communities that are already flat-footed and ill-prepared for the impacts of climate change. The issues that arise from climate change, including safety and disaster preparedness, should be paramount when considering how and where to include additional housing. We cannot ignore that these things are interconnected. And I unfortunately feel that now we're in a position where we have to deal with a state mandate. And ultimately, there's going to be some sort of reckoning as we continue to deal with climate change. But I think, the comments that have come up tonight sort of cover it. And I have some additional kind of granular specific feedback, which I will share with you or you maybe over email, just to keep it brief here. But thank you again. I appreciate all the time.
So when you make your comments, was there anything in particular you wanted to see changed? Like on the report, it says 20% inclusionary, and then we've seen an alternative for 15. So is that something you want, state whether that's something you want to see, if you'd rather see a different figure, if you don't want to see inclusionary at all?
Well, I guess it's hard for me to say that without knowing what are the chances of, if we remove that or if we lower that percentage, are we going to get another letter saying we're not compliant? And then where does that leave us? So I prefer 15%, but I feel like I also don't want to put us in a position where we're having to kind of go back to step one. So that's my concern.
We could have to go back to step one again. Correct?
I think that having an inclusionary requirement is important for a community like Belvedere, where it's so difficult to demonstrate that a pathway to meeting the lower income RHNA, just because of the costs, because of the complexity of development in Belvedere. And so having that requirement, whatever it is, 20%, 15%, 10%, having an inclusionary requirement in there is going to be very helpful for getting to yes with HCD. So that's, I think that answers your question.
Could we look at it? Could we look at 10%? Could we look at 15% and see where that puts us and then.
Yeah,
determine-
so I think we have this, you know, there's a chart and it has the, you know, the buffer. If we reduce, the way we're getting to the buffer that we have now for the lower income is through as it stands in the draft, right, is with a 20% requirement. If we reduce that to 10%, then the buffer on the lower income arena gets smaller, if you see what I mean, or possibly even dips below. Now, there's ways to address that. We could assume, for example, that more of the units on the boardwalk, because the boardwalk site is at least 30 dwelling units per acre. So that is a density that the state deems will be affordable to lower income households. So we could potentially assume that a higher percentage of the units on the boardwalk count them towards lower income arena. However, if we do that, we're likely to get more questions from the state about whether that's realistic, or if the boardwalk does build out with those units and they don't end up being affordable for lower income households, then the city's in a position of having to find other sites elsewhere. What I'm saying is there is an option to reduce a little bit, reduce it a lot, but you have to compensate with it somewhere else, and compensating with it somewhere else creates its own risks. So it's a push and pull.
Have you seen cities get approval on their housing element without that inclusionary element in there?
Yes, some cities have, but every city is different. Every city has a different, different context. And, some cities have more land, some cities have more sites. I go back to this point that I made in the presentation about how few sites there are in Belvedere that meet those strict requirements for lower income sites in terms of their size and being free of environmental constraints and all the rest of it. So it just is a very it's a big challenge to demonstrate that there's capacity for the lower income arena. And I think that an inclusionary requirement is very helpful for building that case with HCD.
Okay. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? No. Okay. Commissioner Burke?
Thank you. I thought it was a productive discussion this evening. Again, thank you for the work you and staff have done and the task force has done to evolve the housing element considerably. I think there are many, many things about it that are significantly improved. And so I think that's a good thing. I mean, for me, it's really about balancing doing the right thing and complying with the state rules and regulations. And those things aren't necessarily compatible at all times. And so, I think that we always need to be mindful to Commissioner Johnson's comments, mindful of the community and what makes this community unique, or the unique environment that we exist in, and how to balance those characteristics with the need to comply with this goal of 160. As I've shared before, I feel very strongly that we should not rezone those two cluster sites. And we should find some other way of dealing with that, going back and looking at the numbers and see if we can still get to a comfortable place without, again, compromising what I think is very thoughtful zoning that was put in place. I also think I'm more of the mind that the inclusion target should be 10%, because we should be consistent with the state density bonus law, because I feel like that will sort of come in to play more often and make the 15% less relevant. We can still think of other incentives that apply that are over and above what maybe the density bonus law gives to give developers incentives to build in Belvedere. We need to resolve whether or not those other two land sites can in fact accommodate those incremental units, because my understanding is that there is a range, 5 to 20. That doesn't mean you have to build or you are being compelled to build 20 on that site. If that site's not big enough to house 20, then maybe you can only build 16 or 12 or 13. So I think it's a false narrative to say that it's all about, you must reach the 20. That's why the range exists, because there's another variable that has to be factored into the consideration. I also think that we, should go through this one more time with a fine tooth comb and make sure that everything is ticked and tied. But beyond that, I also think to ensure that the policies are and programs are consistent with the decisions and decisions and discussions we're having in the community today around other projects, specifically Mallard Point. I think Mr. Dorfman brought up some valid comments that we should make sure we go back and look at and ensure that what's here is consistent with the decisions we've already put forward as a planning commission, and make sure if there's any discrepancy that we, go back and resolve that, or we affirm that, yes, in fact, that is how we're moving forward. So we're not creating other issues that we have to reconcile later on down the road. But again, I think it's very good work. I think it's a good step forward, a very good step forward. And I believe, there's more to do. We need to, again, hear from other stakeholders as this thing continues to sort of move its way to being ready to submit. But thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Lasky.
I really don't have too much more to say from what I did, but I think we all are interested in getting the housing element finished, and we want more housing, but we want to be sure it really fits into our community. And I think you really have done a great job, and the report was very concise. I do think, Kevin, I worked on this before on the housing, and I think it's difficult to come to the numbers without rezoning some of the areas. I don't know. If it can be accomplished, it would be great. I don't know if it can. So that's something to have to look at. And I think on the boardwalk, you were trying to make Tiburon and Belvedere exactly the same there, which I think is important because it would be very confusing to build that and not have it the 15% instead of the 20. So I think that's important to do that. That's really all I have to say. I think time is of the essence because this has to go to the city council, and we also need to get this submitted in January. Is that correct?
No, it's the rezoning that has to be completed by the end of January.
The rezoning.
Obviously, time is of the essence, however, because there is a vulnerability associated with having an out of compliance housing element.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Seidel.
Thank you. I think it's a thoughtful update. I'm largely in support of it. On a couple of the items that came up tonight in our discussion, I'm in favor of a minimum of 15% inclusionary. I think 20% sounds a little better, a little more generous. I think you impressed on me how these are all interrelated factors, and given the fact that we've had a little trouble getting this through HCD, I guess, as the governing authority, I'm thinking we should give it as much as we feel like we can. I'm in favor of the rezoning of the cluster sites. I think that would just be helpful in the future for clarity of how they can be developed. The R2 zoning, while nice for another era, I think it's probably seen its day. On the subject of parking, I think if you're looking at redeveloping a site like the boardwalk into higher density multifamily housing, that the existing parking requirements in Belvedere may be too high for that. I don't know that, I don't remember the exact number. If it's reduced to one parking space requirement might be a bit low. Typically what we're seeing in a lot of multifamily development in the Bay Area is something around 1.5. So, I think some thought can be given to that, but I think just maintaining the existing standards might not be appropriate for some of the types of higher density projects that we're going to see in the future. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Commissioner Slaymaker.
Yes, I agree also that we've made great strides, and I commend all of you for all your work on this. It is so much easier to understand also which is beneficial to the community, I think. I do agree with my fellow commissioners that it should be 15% because it just makes sense to me that we have Tiburon and Belvedere on the same tracks with that percentage. And I do also agree that in some areas, rezoning makes sense possibly for the particular areas. But I do feel we need some fine convincing, and also that we need to be sure that the things we've said tonight have the ability to be written up so that we feel like the next step is going to be possible and easier for us to get approval.
Thank you. Commissioner Hart?
I also thank you a lot for putting together this whole wonderful package, so much easier to read than the previous one. It was much easier. And I do also favor the 15% inclusionary, specifically if and when the Tiburon Belvedere project, if that would go forward, so we sit on the same page. I would like to see a real effort not to have to go into rezoning. But if it would in a major way help us get the final map for us to comply with the housing that we need to come up, then I guess we would have to do it. But I think if it could go through again and see how we could do it without rezoning, I think that would be a very good step forward. And I think with all the fine tooth comb reading that Commissioner Burke has gone through here, I think if that is all addressed page by page and point by point, I think we will ultimately have a very good thing to send back to Sacramento. So I feel very comfortable that it won't be many times that we'll have to go through it like this again, but that you will have presented a very good housing element for us. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have some concern. People are talking rezoning, and I don't think that was the purpose of the PUD, was to rezone the PUD.
What do you mean by rezoning? That it's not radically changing because multifamily housing is already allowed there. It's making some adjustments to that zoning in order to increase the potential capacity. So that a bit of nuance.
Yeah. So, and I think some people got somebody said rezoning the PUD and that got stuck in their
I
heads.
see.
Anyway, so I have some concerns over the PUD overlay and the clusters, and it has to do with combining parcels that are partially R2 and partially R3. And I think that the community in general, as we have seen recently, really likes their R2 zone. And I don't think the R2 zone is going to be what the R2 zone is today, because larger buildings are going to be going in there. But I think that having a separation of the size and the density from the R2 to the R3 is really important. I think that when our city was developed by the land company, that they may not have known it, but they kind of were at the forefront of, urban development by having single-family homes, duplexes, and then apartment buildings, and finally a commercial area. So I have a little bit of concern on the PUD overlay where we're combining zones, because I think that if we do that, this commission is allowing the R2 zone to be abolished. And I think that we need to really think about that, because what we're deciding today is what this community is going to look like in 8 and 10 years. And people are going to look back at us and say, what were they thinking? Did they not realize what they were doing? So the clusters, I have issues with that, with the combined zones. I'd almost like not to see the R2 zone included in the PUD overlay for that specific reason. Also, the incentives that you're putting in the PUD overlay, for instance, is if you do the 15% inclusionary, that will reduce the setbacks and will increase height, just for the ones along beach, and increase density, that all of those are included in the bonus density. And if they do 15%, they're going to get their concession, they're going to get their waivers. So I don't know why we're like reducing what we have, like reducing the size, they're increasing the lot coverage from 40 to 45, when they can do that anyway with bonus density or a concession. So I think that it's like if we give 45, then they'll have a bonus waiver that will increase it even more. And so we're just slowly chipping away at the community that we have, I feel. So I think that the bonus density law gives developers a lot of leeway. And I think once they qualify for bonus density, I think they get everything that they need to build. So I'm little hesitant on just increasing the concessions they get just for doing the 20% on top of what they're going to get with the bonus density. Also, I know that we talk about the buffer, and we have a pretty large buffer compared to what other cities have done. Tiburon buffer was 9%. They're bigger, they have more sites, I understand that. But I'd like to see a little bit of study done on the different inclusionary levels so that we can make the right decision. A little study, nexus study on 10%, 15%, and comparing it to a no percent, just so we can see what those differences are. And then I just wonder, I mean, the chances of us being accepted on our second round, that if we give everything away in this round and they come back and we got to find more, where are we going to find more if we put everything on the table? We're just going to say, that's it, you got everything we got. So we're going to have nowhere to go. So that's just my hesitation with putting everything on in the second round, is chances are slim that they'll take us on our second round. I mean, do you know anyone who's been accepted on the second round other than maybe Novato?
Yeah, I can't say. Usually it takes more than 2 submittals. Yeah, anyway.
So that's just, my food for thought, because you're right, we don't have to build it, but prior housing elements, it was always, oh, no one will ever build it. And that no longer holds true. What we're going to prove, we have to look at it as if it is going to be built in whatever form or fashion. And so that's what we need to give food to thought, as what kind of city are we allowing to be developed and yet abiding by the law?
if I could just offer one sort of point of clarification, I think, for everyone. A lot of talk about state density bonus law, and it is important because it's a real thing when projects are proposed. But for the purpose of projecting, demonstrating the capacity of the zoning map and projecting in the housing element, we can't count on state density bonus. So we need to be able to demonstrate a path to meeting the RENA requirements that doesn't include state density bonus, which is why we're proposing, you know, all these various inclusionary strategies. So I see you nodding, so I just want to make sure that everyone understands that. We can't dial them back and say, oh, but we'll get there with state density bonus because the state won't accept that for certification of the element.
I just want someone to look back in 8 and 10 years and say,
Yeah.
this planning commission, which I think has given a lot to the community in making the decisions, the tough decisions, that they made the tough decisions, but it was a good decision.
Yeah, and I think we've got some good directions, some good things to study and options to bring back to you at the next meeting. So we'll certainly do that. I also want to just clarify that the PUD overlay changes that we're talking about don't apply in all R2 and all R3. They only apply in those 2 little clusters. So it's not the case that even if you went forward with the proposal that's in there now that includes both R3 and R2 in those clusters, it's not the case that other R2 would be affected by those changes. It's only in those limited areas. I understand we're gonna study other options and bring them back to you, but just want to make that point.
And also, I want to thank you and Allison, your whole team, for the work that you've done. It's been much easier to work with you. And I think we've gotten a much better project. So thank you very much. And with that, we don't need to make any resolutions or anything like that. So meeting adjourned. Nana, quick run.